Hi, I'm Chuck Braverman. This is another episode of Westdoc Online. We have a terrific episode today that's a little different than most. Instead of a director talking about his latest film, we have one of the most influential people in the documentary business, Mr. Thom Powers, who is a filmmaker, originally making films for HBO and PBS. He's the festival programmer at the Toronto International Film Festival. He co-founded Doc NYC. He has a podcast called Pure Nonfiction. He did Stranger Than Fiction at IFC Center for 15 years. A little doc fest in New York, the largest in the United States, called Doc NYC. A Substack called Doc Voices. And if that's not enough, he teaches at NYU in the School of Visual Arts. Hi, Tom, how are you?
Thank you for that introduction, Chuck. I'm good.
You're welcome, and you deserve it. So you are one of the most influential people, and I think amongst all those things that you're known for, maybe TIFF, Toronto, is the most important. And I'm curious, how did you make the transition from being a filmmaker to a programmer and everything else that you're doing?
Yeah, so, my career trajectory, I started out in publishing, working for the underground comic book publisher Fantagraphics Books. I loved film, and when I was in my mid-20s, after having worked in publishing for a while, I wanted to give film a try, and particularly documentary film, was that kind of merger of journalism that I practiced at a magazine called The Comics Journal, and that's what was drawing me. So I moved to New York in 1994, met my business partner, Mima Spadola. We started a company called Sugar Pictures and made documentaries for 10 years. Probably the two best-known films we made is a film called Breasts that Mima directed, about interviewing women about their breasts, and then we made a follow-up called Private Dicks, interviewing men about their bodies. Those in the late 1990s, that was part of HBO's trend of exploring sexuality in a way that wasn't really happening on any other television outlet. So after 10 years of making documentaries, I was drawn to showing them, because for me that was the favorite part of my experience. Once a film was finished, to be able to, even though my films were, all for television, before they'd go on television, we'd have a screening in a New York theater, and I loved everything about that experience, including just like figuring out who should be in that theater, bringing in journalists or bringing in people who I thought might help my career afterwards, bringing in specialists around that subject, and the unique and special thing that happens when people are together and people from different fields are meeting each other, that had a real excitement for me. And I wanted, it was frustrating to me that I had to, in order to have that experience, spend 2 or more years making a film. I only got to have that experience every couple of years when I make a film. So at the end of 10 years of making films, I was thinking about trying to do something different. I had this passion for documentary film, but I wanted to do something different. And that was in 2005. IFC Center had just opened, and I approached them and asked them if I could do a weekly screening series. Also at that time, I knew a lot of filmmakers who even would go to a big festival like Sundance or Toronto, and if they were among the majority of films that didn't immediately sell for a distribution deal, they would then come back to New York and have to, figure out some new way to get people to see their film. Often that meant that they would rent a screening room in order to try to get buyers to come see their film. So they might be spending several $100s to rent a screening room in New York to try to get buyers to come see their film. I saw this opportunity with IFC Center where I could hold a screening. Instead of filmmaker paying to screen their film, I could pay them a little bit of an honorarium, and I could get to practice this thing that I really love to do, which is, think about who should be in that room, and how do you go out and get them. So that's how I made that transition from making films to screening them.
And what about, I'm going to switch to Toronto for a minute. So you're not Canadian, I assume you're American, right?
I grew up in Detroit, just a few miles from the border of Canada. So does
that give you an edge with the Canadians?
I feel like I did grow up with Canadian media. I grew up listening to CBC radio, watching the Canadian television channel that would come through, making frequent trips to Canada. When I was in my 20s, I started going to the Toronto Film Festival just as a film fan. I would go for a weekend and watch 15 films, and it was a big part of my film education.
So my question really is, how did you get to be the programmer of docs? Was there any, maybe this is a silly question, but I've spent a lot of time in Toronto at Hot Docs, and I think everybody that works at Hot Docs, or most everybody, is certainly a Canadian, and they have kind of a Canadian edge, although they have docs from all over the world. But I wonder if there was two strikes against you in a way, being an American coming into Toronto, or no?
Well, I think when I got hired, which was at the kind of end of 2005, going into the 2006 season in Toronto, this is 20 years ago. It's easy to forget that documentary film was not as developed a field, and especially documentary film festivals were not as developed a field as they are today. In the last 20 years, we've watched the rise of festivals like, True False and Camden and Doc NYC, for that matter, and a whole cadre of documentary film festival programmers that have grown up with that kind of specialty. When I started the Stranger Than Fiction series at IFC Center in 2005, one of the reasons I was starting it is because that stuff didn't exist. I mean, today New York City has a movie theater at DCTV specifically devoted to documentary film. Back in 2005, those opportunities were a lot harder to come by. So when the Toronto Film Festival was looking for a programmer, the list of people who had carved this out as a specialty was not as long a list as it would be today. And also at TIFF, there was a culture, as there is today, of having programmers who live around the world, and that was, and I think is, one of the strengths of its programming. So, at the time I was hired, Diana Sanchez, who covered Latin American and Spanish-speaking cinema for us, lived in Madrid. Giovanna Fulvi, our programmer who has specialized in Asian cinema for over 20 years, is based in Italy. There are a number of TIFF programmers who are based elsewhere, and throughout the year, that programming team of 20 or so people are putting their feet in the ground of every filmmaking continent in the world, and that really helps. So I think for for me, being based in New York City, especially in 2006, when New York City was, a very main hub of North American documentary making, and it still remains, a stronghold. Is probably, I think communities have grown more widespread. It may. I think there were great advantages back in 2005 to being in New York City for a documentary career. That's diffused a little in an age of more widespread internet and Zoom communications and things like that.
How many doc films would you typically watch at TIFF, and what's the criteria, and how do you judge what's going to make it into the film festival?
Yeah, so this past year there were about 900 feature-length documentaries submitted to the festival. About, I think, 75 of those are Canadian entries, and I have colleagues at TIFF who just focus on the Canadian entries. We have a team of screeners who are watching those films with me, and the ones that are most impressive to them, they'll pass along to me. And then also I'm working with a team of regional specialists who, so Diana Cadavid today looks after Latin American cinema. Natalia Hunter-Young has for years been our specialist in Africa and the Middle East. Dorota Leck is our specialist in Eastern European cinema, and so on. So I have their, great knowledge base to call upon. They'll make recommendations to me of films that they're seeing. If I see something from their region and feel like, I need more background and context to understand that film, I can share it with them. So it is it's a group process.
And how many films do you end up typically?
How many do I watch myself? I don't know. Probably 300 or so each year. Yeah.
And how do you keep track? Don't they begin to blur together?
I guess that's just, a specialty, that, a talent, I guess, in a way, for people who are attracted to this. It's like the difference between people who, have like a great command for social command of recognizing people's faces, and people who don't, or people who have a command of being able to keep track of details. I have friends who can rattle off sports statistics in a way that I can never grasp, even though I do watch a lot of sports. They just have a passion for that they have a net in their mind that will capture those details, and for me those details go past. Like, for whatever reason, I have a net in my mind that can capture aspects of films that I've watched, even though I've watched a lot of them, and it's hard to explain.
Let's switch for a minute about the status of the documentary business-wise today. It seems to me, watching a lot of very good films, that there are a large percentage of films today that are quite good, that are suddenly, within the last 6 months or a year, are not getting picked up by Amazon or Netflix or Apple or Hulu. Now I'm running out of places where big budget important docs can go, and I'm concerned, as everybody else I think in the business is kind of in shock right now as to what's happening. And I could name a dozen films that I've seen in the last few weeks practically that the normal layperson is not going to see. Unless they end up, searching for them maybe later on Amazon Prime and spending $4 to rent it, right? And that is not a sustainable business plan for a doc that costs, $100,000 to $2 million.
I mean, there's no question that we're living in a kind of whiplash moment. I think what, accentuates this moment is that we went through a 10-year period when there were a lot of new distribution outlets that were very welcoming to all kinds of documentaries. With the growth of the streamers, the streamers went through this period where their directive was to spend in order to bring in new subscribers, and a couple of years ago they got a different directive, which was, we're not spending money anymore. We need to justify our expenditures, and if you're a executive at one of these companies, you're being judged very strictly on how many eyeballs are watching this film. And the eyeballs that they need to watch these films are on a global basis and are astronomical. They're in the tens of millions of viewers that need to qualify something as a success. Yeah, I was recently talking to a New York Times reporter who, said that if an article of theirs, gets 1 million views, that is considered a huge success. And some of these streamers, if a film, gets 1 million views, that would be considered a disappointment. So things are really, out of whack. And it's a, another metric we could compare to are nonfiction books on the New York Times bestseller list. You could sell 20,000 copies of a book and be on the New York Times bestseller list. And we look at that as something that may not be reaching a mass audience, but has real importance in the culture. An important nonfiction book that is being read by a certain group of people who are then going to disseminate those ideas further into the culture. That's a key part of the way knowledge spreads. And now we've got this new filter which says, if your vessel for a story, in this case a documentary film, if it can't reach tens of millions of viewers, then there's no place for it. That is, I think that filmmakers were faced with similar blockades. You'd have to go back to the 1970s or 80s when media consolidation was such that if your film wasn't on a network TV, or somehow able to break through to a Hollywood distributor, which almost no documentaries did, short of music documentaries like Woodstock, then you were really left to some kind of DIY movement, and out of that in the 1970s you saw groups like New Day Films, which still exist today, emerge, and documentary makers really taking their films directly to audiences, usually like one small audience at a time. When Julia Reichert passed away recently, I was really struck at her memorial, because she had been one of the founders of New Day Films in the early 70s, and as other of her peers came together and remembered those days, they were remembering a time that was more stark than ours for how you get a film to an audience. I mean, today we do have access to tools that generation in the 1970s could only dream of, to use a platform like Vimeo or YouTube or Kickstarter to help fund or reach your audience. So I think it's easy to feel dismay of the moment we're living in right now, but I think we also have to take stock of of things that we're fortunate to have. And yes, we can look back to 5 years ago when we were living through some kind of golden age, as people would say. But even at that time, the more stuff was getting through, but it was still at the discretion of large corporations who were deciding what films got through and what films didn't. So we are we're definitely in a moment in 2025 when we have to figure out what the new techniques are. I will say that the progressive side of our community and documentary film, may need to take a look at some of the success that right-wing documentaries have had. Last year the top grossing theatrical documentary, not counting music documentaries, was the film Am I Racist? That was galvanized by a right-wing community of media that got viewers out to theaters to watch that movie. I think we on the progressive side may want to ask ourselves, how do we do that? What can we learn from that?
As we sit here and record this, today is January 15th, 2025, and the short list for the Academy Award docs, both in the feature and documentary shorts, have been announced. And I'm wondering, how important do you think the Oscars are in the doc world?
Well, I mean, they remain a tremendous marketing tool, of which we don't really have many others like it. To say that your film is on the Oscar short list, or in a couple weeks we'll have 5 films that can say they're Oscar nominated, 5 feature films and 5 short films. That opens doors like nothing else does to get press coverage, to have screenings, to pique the interest of the public. So, I wish that there were more marketing hooks like that. It used to be that a New York Times rave review would be a comparable marketing hook. Reviews have somewhat been diluted from what they once were. So is it unfortunate that that 5 films that will be the Oscar nominees get to have this tremendous advantage, and the other several hundred films that came out in 2024, many of them great, don't have that advantage? Yes, that disappoints me, but I don't know how to change that. I was part of the team that helped create the Cinema Eye Honors more than 15 years ago, and we never imagined that we were going to be creating a marketing hook, equal to the Oscars. That really wasn't the purpose. It was a way to celebrate other layers of craft in documentary filmmaking that go overlooked when your main award at the Oscars only has one award for documentary. It doesn't have a cinematography award, an editing award, a composing award, producing award, etc. So at Cinema Eye, we were, and AJ Schnock, who continues to lead that event, continues to champion these other crafts, but it's for many reasons that is never going to be a marketing hook as powerful as the Oscars.
So you hosted an event in Hollywood at a beautiful residence called the Vista House a few months ago, and you featured 7 films: Daughters, Frida, I Am Celine, No Other Land, Porcelain War, Sugar Cane, Will, and Harper. And 6 out of the 7 have made, there's 169 films submitted this year, and 15 are on the short list. And you, how many months? 3 months in advance, were able to pick 6 out of the 7 that made the short list. I think that's a pretty good record. How do you feel about those films now?
Well, I've been doing this for a while. I have the Academy documentary branch of 600 or 700 people who vote on the awards. I've interacted with that branch in many different ways as a film festival programmer, interviewing people on pure nonfiction, doing other events for the last 20 years. I have some sense of where their interests are going to go. Every year I'm surprised, and that's what makes it great. Is to be surprised. But yes, if there's a strong overlap between some of the things that I've been able to feature and where the Oscar list shakes out, I think it comes from being a close follower of this for a long time.
For me, it's more difficult to predict, although I think I'm a pretty good predictor too. But the voting population of the Academy has, I think, doubled in the last 3 or 4 years. And so there's a whole bunch of new people that are all over the world, which is in some ways a good thing. And were you surprised at any film in particular, any title that did not make the short list? As I was very surprised at a couple of titles that didn't.
Well, I mean, there's more than 15 great films that come out each year. So, the whole nature of the word short list, it's a short list, and there are many more films that you could put on that list. But I'm more in favor of a big tent approach than a kind of purist approach that says, well, this film shouldn't be called a documentary because of X, Y, or Z.
Well, thanks so much, Thom, for being on the show. We really appreciate it, and you certainly have contributed some wise words to all our documentary filmmakers. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chuck. You've given me big envy of your camera setup, and I hope that later in 2025, when I'm doing these things, I have as good an image quality as you have.